Yo guys, welcome back to another video. Today we're going to go ahead and cover the LoD Wave of Light Season 28 Monk. Specifically, we're going to talk a little bit about the pushing variant as well as the speedrun variant. They're actually pretty similar in terms of their setup, and so it'll be very easy for you to swap back and forth or even just use one set of gear. This build is so powerful that even when you have area damage on your gear, which is typically for pushing, it still works absolutely fine in speedruns. Let's go ahead and hop into some of the skills. So the particular setup that we have right here is for speedruns. I will kind of talk a little bit about the pushing options that you might want to take, so you might be switching out some of these skills if you're interested in pushing. Alright, so first off we're going to go ahead and take Cyclone Strike with Implosion. This is really important because in this build we are using Lefebvre's Soliloquy, which can give us up to 50% damage reduction for 5 seconds when we use Cyclone Strike. As you can see, my roll is absolutely terrible. I am desperate for a better pair of shoulders, but they are working for now, and this build is still very functional despite a lot of suboptimal gear. Now on top of the damage reduction, Cyclone Strike is still very nice for grouping up enemies, and it also allows us to dash from pack to pack while we have Epiphany active. This build is set up in a way where we will always have Epiphany up, and so this is also going to help us move around and group up enemies at the same time. Next up, we're going to take Wave of Light with Explosive Light. This is the skill we're going to be using to do all of our damage. Now for the speedrunning version, I like to take Mantra of Healing here. I actually got this idea from Maxroll. I feel that it works really well. This gives us a shield to protect our Squirt's necklace, and also gives us 3 spirit per second. On top of that, we're going to be using a passive for Chant of Resonance to gain even more spirit every single second that we have this mantra on. The combination between Mantra of Healing and Chant of Resonance is very nice. Allows us to get through rifts very quickly without having to worry about running out of spirit and having any downtime. Now, if you are pushing, I would not recommend taking the Mantra of Healing. As opposed to that, I would recommend that you go with Serenity and Ascension to make it last for 4 seconds. Next up, we're going to be taking Dashing Strike with Blinding Speed. After we dash, we gain 40% increased chance to dodge for 4 seconds. This is really nice to both keep us alive and keep our Squirt's necklace up while we're dodging attacks. Next up, we're going to be taking Mystic Ally with Air Ally. This is incredibly important in the build. This is kind of what allows us to keep going and going and going. We're going to be resetting the cooldown on this very quickly and using it to maintain our spirit. Lastly, we're going to be taking Epiphany with Desert Shroud. This gives us a ton of spirit per second and allows us to dash from enemy to enemy by using Cyclone Strike. This also just reduces all incoming damage by 50%, so it's going to help keep us alive. Moving along to the passives, we're going to start with Seize the Initiative. Dealing damage to enemies above 75% life is going to increase our attack speed for 4 seconds. We'll also be taking the Guardian's Path to gain 35% dodge chance. As we covered earlier, for the speed variant, we'll be taking Chant of Resonance. If you are not playing the speed variant, I would recommend instead going with Determination for the additional damage. And lastly, we'll be taking Beacon of Ytar to reduce all cooldowns by 20%. Alright, so moving along to the gear, of course, we are using Legacy of Dreams, so we have no set bonuses. I will note that a lot of people on the leaderboards right now who are clearing the 150s at the absolute top are actually playing Legacy of Nightmare, and so that may be something you want to keep in mind. Alright, and for the helm slot, we're going to be taking Zokran's Gaze, Dexterity, Vitality, Crit Chance, Wave of Light damage, and a socket with a diamond in it. Do bear in mind that the Wave of Light roll can go up to 150, and so mine is incredibly low. Make sure to keep an eye on that and try to roll as high as you can. Next up is Lefebvre's Soliloquy. Dexterity, area damage, cooldown, resource cost reduction is fine. Alternatively to that, you could go with Resist All Elements or Vitality. Now I am kind of building this up to a pushing version, and so if you're just planning on doing speeds with this, you probably want to drop the area damage to go with Vitality or Resist All Elements. Like most builds, we're going to be using Squirt's Necklace to gain 100% additional damage. Fire damage, crit, and a socket. I do recommend taking Enforcer in this build, regardless of if you're playing pushing or speed. So for the gloves, you actually have a couple of options. You can either go with St. Archus or Stone Gauntlets. My personal recommendation is that if you're doing speed runs, you go with St. Archus gloves. If you're pushing, you probably want to go with Stone Gauntlets unless you have a very high paragon level and a lot of natural toughness as a result. The downside of Stone Gauntlets this season is completely eliminated by both your Epiphany and the Altar of Rites, so even if your Epiphany falls off, you're never going to have to worry about the adverse effects of the Stone Gauntlets. If you're pushing, you're going to want to take area damage, crit, cooldown. If you are doing speeds, Dexterity, crit, cooldown. For the chest piece, we're going to go with Cinder Coat, fire damage, Dexterity, Vitality, or reduce all damage from elites, and 3 sockets with diamonds in them. For the wrists, you'll either want to go with Pinto's Prides or Bindings of the Lesser Gods. You're going to wear one and put the other one in the cube, so whichever one you can roll higher is going to work absolutely fine for this slot. You're going to want fire damage, dexterity, vitality, crit hit chance, and as high of a secondary roll as you can get. For the belt slot, we're going to be taking the Witching Hour, dexterity, vitality, attack speed, crit hit damage. These are going to be the stats that you're going to want to take. And for the ring, we're going to go with unity, crit, increased damage against elites, and a socket. I recommend taking Bane of the Trapped here. For the other ring, we'll be taking Convention of Elements. If you're pushing, I would recommend going with area damage over dexterity. If you're just doing speed runs, dexterity or average damage will do just fine. Other than that, crit, socket, and of course we'll be using the Legacy of Dreams. For the pants slot, we're going to be using Blackthorns. These are the only pants in the game that can roll elemental damage on them. We are not benefiting from a set bonus, and so this is not going to break our Legacy of Dreams, so long as we're not wearing another piece of Blackthorns. You'll want to take fire damage, dexterity, vitality, and resist all elements. For the feet, we're going to be taking the Crudest Boots. Mine are terrible, so don't roll these stats. You'll want dexterity, vitality, resist all elements, and Wave of Light damage. Alright, and for our first weapon, we're going to be taking Kiroshiro's Blade. Dexterity is fine, I'd rather have 10% damage here. Area damage is good, cooldown is good, and a socket with an emerald in it. Once again, feel free to drop the area damage if you are just planning on doing speed runs. And for our other weapon, I've got Rabid Strike here. Rolls naturally 35% crit hit damage, 24% area damage is good. If you are just doing speed runs, go ahead with 10% damage there instead. Cooldown reduction, and a socket with an emerald in it. Make sure to keep an eye on these secondary rolls. Of course, this one's perfect because it is primal. This one's missing about 8%, so try to roll these as high as possible because you will notice a big damage loss if you do not have good rolls on these secondary slots. Now, one note that I want to make about Legacy of Dreams is that this is a hard build to properly gear out. There's a lot of secondary rolls that you have to rely on getting really high to optimize your damage. And on top of that, you need ancient items in every single slot so that you are not missing out on this bonus of 375% damage. Alrighty, so moving on over to the cube, we're going to start with our weapon slot. Incense Torch of the Grand Temple reduces the spirit cost of Wave of Light by 50% and increases its damage by 550%. Next slot, we'll either be taking Bindings of the Lesser Gods or Pinto's Pride, depending on which one you're wearing. Enemies hit by your Cyclone Strike take 200% increased damage from your Mystic allies for 5 seconds. And lastly, we're going to be taking Obsidian Ring of the Zodiac so that we can keep our Epiphany up, and on top of that, it's going to allow us to spam this Mystic ally to really keep our spirit high. We'll also be able to dash very frequently. Now, when it comes to the follower, you're welcome to either go with the Scoundrel or the Enchantress. Both are really good for this build. I'd say go with whichever one you've got better gear on. Just make sure that your follower can survive in rifts. If it's not perfectly geared out, you may instead want to go with the token that ensures that they cannot die. Just make sure that you have the essential items, including the Flavor of Time, Nemesis Bracers, Gloves of Worship, and Oculus Ring. Now, of course, because we are wearing a Unity in this build, you're also going to need to put a Unity on your follower so that you're splitting damage with them. One note that I will make is that when I'm pushing, I am absolutely going to swap out the token over here to ensure that he cannot die, because when we're going to be splitting damage in those really high tiers, my Scoundrel will absolutely go down unless he has that token on. Granted, in speedruns, he seems to survive pretty well because I've got all of his gear augmented with intelligence. It's all rolled very high to get him a lot of vitality, resist all elements, regeneration. He's very, very durable. And so he's great for speedruns, but of course, once you start pushing, it is really dangerous to be using something like Unity where you're splitting damage with him and a token that does not keep him alive. Now, before I show a bit of gameplay for this build, I wanted to go into a few tips and tricks to help you optimally play this build. The first one I'm going to talk about is when you have Epiphany active, which pretty much should be all the time, you're going to want to get around by using Cyclone Strike. When there's an enemy that you're targeting with Cyclone Strike, while Epiphany is up, you're going to teleport to them. This is going to save your dash charges. You only really want to be using your dash charges when you don't have an enemy that you can teleport to with Cyclone Strike. This is a really important element of the build because when you use Dashing Strike as opposed to Cyclone Strike to travel, you're also kind of interrupting your Ring of the Zodiac because it's going to be reducing the cooldown on this when we would much rather have it reducing the cooldown on our Mystic ally and our epiphany. And so you really only want to dash when there are absolutely no enemies around and you have to get from point A to point B quickly. Make sure when you're doing speed runs, you're popping your mantra of healing fairly often to keep that shield up to protect your Squirt's necklace. Now, one really important thing to note about this build is that your Rapid Strike is going to kind of create a mimic of you that is also going to throw out a wave of light. The mimic is actually doing the vast majority of your damage, and you will notice a huge DPS loss if your mimic happens to get stuck behind some kind of rock or a wall, and they're just kind of casting wave of light into nothing. You will notice a huge damage drop off. And so the second you notice that, you're going to kind of want to reposition yourself and get that mimic to get around the wall or around the rock or whatever is blocking it so that you can get back to doing damage. Now, the last note that I'd like to make about this build is that you don't want to just be spamming Mystic Ally all the time for Spirit. This is going to mess up your Obsidian Ring of the Zodiac because, of course, it's going to start reducing the cooldown on this, when instead it could be reducing the cooldown on Epiphany. Make sure that you're really only using this if you're down about 200 or so Spirit and you're struggling to cast skills. On top of that, if you are just spamming this and then you happen to get into combat a moment later and get really low on Spirit, it can become really problematic because then you'll run out and you will actually have no way to get it back. And so just be cautious of when you're using this skill. Alrighty guys, that just about does it for this one. I'm going to go ahead and put up some gameplay footage of a GR that I cleared right before I made this video, but I really appreciate you guys for stopping in. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one.
Every time you come back, it's like falling down these lies again. This feeling that I have deep down inside.